whole of human history is full of secrets and mysteries. In fact, even now, in the age of science and technology, our whole world order is causing thousands of questions, many of which cannot be fully answered by scientists. Time Puzzle Crew tries to uncover some of those mysteries surrounding the mysterious places of Kazakhstan.
In today's episode of the Time Puzzle, the most mysterious place of the Ile Alatau mountain range. An ancient temple and archaeologists' other wonderful finds, facing an inexplicable phenomenon. Time travelers. Where did this place get its name from? Tragedies and victories in the history of Medeo. A group of tourists was warming by the fire on the mountainside. The light of the fire dispelled the night darkness for only a few meters. Suddenly, one of the people listened warily, turned around and pointed with his hand to the darkness. In a faint light, the tourists saw two figures walking about at a distance. They were like ordinary young people, but after examining them, the guys were dumbfounded. The sudden guests looked very strange. They were not dressed for a hike in the mountains. Ordinary tights, t-shirts and sneakers, and all their clothes were of the 80s of the last century. At the same time, they did not have any backpacks or flashlights. They simply silently walked past the people and the fire without even answering the greetings and the invitation to warm themselves by the fire, and disappeared into the darkness. There was silence in the camp. Tourists looked at each other in fright without any idea how to explain such a strange meeting. As it later turned out, such incidents are not uncommon in this area. No wonder it is considered the most mystical in the vicinity of Almaty. In this episode, I began to collect stories related to these places. And these stories were mystical, these stories were unusual. And I happened to be one of the characters in some of these stories. People lived here in the Bronze Age. This is evidenced by findings made by archaeologists. And on this territory they built a temple, they built a large settlement, and it already was the basis of the proto-city, which now is our city, Almaty. The tragic history of the underground church. In August of 1921, these monks were shot by the Red Army men who were staying in that church. Watch this and many other things in today's episode of the Time Puzzle. Everyone who has been to Almaty probably went up to the mountains to the most famous site of the city, Medeo. The sports complex is known all over the world as the highest mountain skating rink. It is located at an altitude of 1,691 meters above sea level. But very few people know what other interesting stories are kept in this place, the Tract of Medeo. My name is Andrei Slozhin and you're watching the Time Puzzle. The Medeo Tract is located in the foothills of the Ile Alatau mountain range, in the valley of the Malaya Almatinka River, just 15 kilometers from the center of Almaty. Since 1980, this place has become a feature of the city. The tract itself is located above the confluence of the Kazachka and Battery rivers in a small closed valley. In the north, it is surrounded by the Komisarovsky Range, in the east by the foothills of Kaburgatau, and in the southwest by the Kumbel mountain range. The natural boundary of Medeo is one of the most beautiful places in the vicinity of Almaty. It is located at the level of more than 1,000, from 1,520 meters to 1,750 meters. The tract is a favorite place for residents and visitors of the city. Here you can go for a walk, go skating or drink a cup of hot tea in the nearby cafes. Known throughout the world thanks to the high mountain skating rink, it is considered one of the symbols of the country, but very few people know the true history of this tract. Archaeologist Ruslan Shabayev decided to explore these white spots. We explored the entire Medeo Gorge, and knowing that this area has the most favorable climatic conditions, which are generally found in Almaty, we began to investigate. And we found about 9 archaeological monuments in this gorge. Most of the monuments are the dwellings of ancient people, but one find particularly struck archaeologists because they discovered the remains of a cult structure very close to the Medeo complex. We are at the excavation site. Now we have determined where is the main part of our temple. You mean here already was a temple? Yes, here it was a temple already. And these are the supporting ones are the stones hold for the wooden structures. The stones hold for the wooden structures so that it would not sink. Here is the first and here is the second one. That one went underground. Here's another one. And as it turns out, here we have such a hexagon. This is the central room. There are also very small niches, separate niches. And here in these niches, here is the hearth. There is another hearth. How did it work? In these definite areas at a certain time in the spring on the Nowruz, that's exactly where the sun stands from. Here, from this place, we have checked this out. This mountain? Yes, and there was the hearth. And on June the 22nd it goes straight to this point. From here? Yes, from the top. They built this right hearth, they did it here. And what else was here? And here is the autumn solstice. And the niches, to these special niches they put special sacrifices. They put some meal in the cups and put the cups there. It turns out that since the Bronze Age, it's 3,500 years ago, people have already chosen this place for housing. Here they were engaged and a little bit of farming, and they built their homes. Already in the Saka period, they went a little lower, and here in this territory they built a temple. They built a large settlement. And this was already the basis of the proto-city, which now is our city, the southern capital, Almaty. The cult of fire has been practiced all over the world since ancient times. It was widely spread among the Indo-Iranian peoples, and it also occurs in many European countries, for example, among the Irish and the Romans. In the modern sense, the cult of fire worship refers to Zoroastrianism. It is there that fire is considered a mediator between the world of the living and the world of spirits and gods. According to the assumption of archaeologists, in the temple, which was located in the tract of Medeo, people practiced not only the worship of the fire element. Here in this place we found a jaw of some felines. We cannot yet say whether it was a leopard or a lynx. It is zoologists' job to determine it with the help of only one bone. We need something else. But it is, and it belonged to a predatory animal. There are also the remains of birds here. It seems maybe, well, they could be peasants or something else. In addition to the ritual attributes, archaeologists have discovered other finds which testify to the rich life in the Medeo tract already thousands of years ago. Metallurgy, wood carving, bone carving and weaving. And this was already important for that time. And of course, there was a smithy. But let's go back to the mysterious temple. As it turned out, they were also seeing off to the afterlife. Another fact is curious. The funeral took place elsewhere, and in this temple only the preparation of the deceased for burial was conducted. It was a complicated process because they could have buried a corpse a long time after the death of a person. They did posthumously trepanation. I mean, the head was drilled, then the brain was pulled out and the body was stored. And on a certain day, for example, on June the 22nd, a certain number of tribal chiefs were already gathering, and it was no longer here that they were doing all this. From here they marched to the Burundai cemetery. And there they had already buried the body with all their honor. This practice of burial wasn't used for ordinary people. Mostly these were representatives of the upper classes. Military officers, some kind of foremen were here, and they were buried on certain days. Because they, on the day of the spring equinox, on the day of the summer solstice, on the day of the autumnal equinox, or on the day of the winter solstice, all these things they did certain rituals. If a person, for example, died in the winter, he was prepared here, mummified, and he was prepared for a certain day to be buried. The temple and settlement were opened not so long ago, in 2009. During the excavations, it was discovered that this settlement existed here since the Bronze Age for a long time. The earliest finds date from the 10th century BC. Most of the items that were found were created in the 6th to 4th centuries BC. In the same way, several objects from the 1st and 3rd centuries of our era were removed from the ground. Here about 300 people lived in the same period. But here it was a priestly settlement. There were 300 priests alone, while with their families as well, and there were some manufacturing centers, some workshops. People from all over the region came here because it was like a center. Ruslan Shabayev's archaeological detachment became convinced that the Medeo tract has a special power and energy on personal experience. Here is a curious story archaeologists told the crew of the time puzzle. Since we started our work here, on every monument where we start to work, we are necessarily doing this sacrifice. At least me, my team. When we just began for the first time, when we just started to do, when we just settled down, we made no sacrifices. Right on this spot, we made no sacrifices. And the crew of 365 Info KZ came here to film us. They were only getting up here and their Land Rover burned down. This place will take its victim from anyone and we do not make the sacrifice. But when we did, everything calmed down. And this happens to us everywhere, on any monument. Someone might find this a coincidence, but there are too many cases in history when such alleged coincidences took place. And although archaeologists cannot be called superstitious people, there is a special aura in such places which even people of science cannot ignore. Every archaeological monument preserves energy. For example, here is the temple. Lots of people made their prayers here. Why do people keep coming here? Because this energy is here, and it exists. People come here and immediately forget about their problems. Joy, emotions, fresh air, breathe. It's such a place, and it must breathe and live. It's alive. But there are places where there are similar settlements, but they are dead. In other gorges, they are dead. People do not come there. Not only that, for centuries, people came here to get help from the gods they believed in. So to this day, the natural boundary of Medeo is considered one of the most mystical places in the vicinity of Almaty. People who go to the mountains probably heard many mystical legends about a meeting with supernatural things on the slopes of the Medeo tract. Denis Sukov, a tourist, a passionate admirer of mountain hikes, who devoted past 25 years to this hobby, told us the most interesting stories. For this considerable period, he managed not only to collect a bunch of mountain legends, but also to participate in some of them. Literally, somewhere about 7 years ago, me with my friends went to the gorge. Even before there was a big storm, there were very beautiful places, high pine trees, a perfect view. We lit a fire, sat talking, and suddenly one of my friends became alarmed. The time was about 11 p.m. We saw 4 people, young, somewhere in the distance of 20 meters from us. They were walking in a line. And how do you think what seemed the most unusual to us? Firstly, they were dressed in old clothes. It definitely was the clothes from the Soviet times. I mean sneakers, blue tights, dynamo blazers, caps with peaks. But there were 2 things that caught my eye. First, they walked in the dark without lanterns, and they walked quietly. That is, you need to be very careful if you want to walk quietly in the mountains, because branches break, leaves rustle, spruce needles shuffle under your feet. And they walked absolutely silently. Even though they were greeted and invited to the fire, the mysterious travelers remained silent. Experienced tourists know that the higher you climb into the mountains, the more often you meet kind and affable people. There is an unspoken rule. You need to greet each other with just a few phrases. But these strange people did not react at all. They passed like shadows and disappeared in the dark. Dennis and his friends could not find a logical explanation for this mystical meeting. They agreed that they were guests from another time.
Чем больше ты веришь в сверхъестественное, тем чаще.
The more you believe in the supernatural, the more often it happens to you. When a person feels it mentally, when he doesn't break the bond with the world that is around him, and mountains, they are so peculiar. Everything is filled with a certain energy, the trees, the stones. I mean, if you try to feel it, you get the pass in that, how to say, world of supernatural. Denis Sukov shared another curious story that happened in the Medeo tract long before the beginning of his trips to the mountains.
Например, такая история произошла.
For example, this story. It happened in 1971 during the construction of a ski resort. There were trailers for builders. There were 8 builders in a trailer. This was told by my uncle's friend. He also worked at the construction site. He was in another trailer, but he saw these people and talked to them. And I heard a story from him that when they removed large stones from the road, they built the road. At night, one day, it was, if I'm right, it was late autumn. An old man knocked at the trailer to builders. An old man came in. He had a stick like a staff. He got quite angry and went into the trailer and said, "Why are you turning stones and why are you spoiling everything here?" The builders hesitated somehow. They could not understand what was happening. Then one of the builders got courageous and answered the angry old man that they plan to build a place where people from all over the world will come. A place where you can spend time with your family and friends. A place that will glorify the country. After listening to the young man's response, the old man suddenly smiled and left the trailer. The builders immediately looked after him, but there was absolutely no one around. Later I heard a few more legends about this old man. That is, people met on the road at night, an old man with a staff, and at different times. If this story happened, let's say in 1971, then people met him in the 90s and in the 2000s. People met an unusual old man who could not be described, and this was exactly here in the tract. Mystics call this old man the master of the mountains, the caretaker of nature. Skeptics believed that the elder could simply live in these mountains as a hermit because in the time of the establishment of Soviet power in the region, many people disagreed with the new government and went away to the mountains. In some historical sources, there are references to the fact that in the last century monks lived in the tract. Moreover, there was an underground church and a monastery. This church was most brightly described by the nun of the Iva Seraphim monastery of Magdalene.
Она рассказывала о том, что это было такое, не слишком большое помещение.
She said that there was quite a small room. From her stories, it is clear that it was a room somewhere around 20 square meters where believers gathered. There was an altar, the iconostasis. Naturally, there was a ventilation because the candles were burning, and these monks prayed there. Nearby, there were also underground cells where they lived.
Далеко были их также подземные кельи, где они жили.
Alexander Suvorov, the archpriest of the Holy Ascension Cathedral in the early 90s, as a schoolboy heard this story from a nun. Then she was a parishioner of St. Nicholas Cathedral. In addition, historians do not deny this version of the existence of the underground church. They also explain why the clergy went high into the mountains.
После установления советской власти, естественно, церковь была отделена от государства.
After the establishment of the Soviet power, naturally, the church was separated from the state and declared, not only the church, in general religion was declared an opium for the people. And accordingly, ministers, religious ministers, they were persecuted, repressed, and there is such information that some monks went to the mountains. And it also happened here in Medeo and other gorges. This church was located on a hill known as Maknatka or Maknataya Sobka. It was organized by Ira monk Seraphim and Ira monk Ferdnost.
Они приходили в эту церковь, совершали...
They came to this church, performed services there, and also pilgrims came from the city to this temple. This indeed was such a spiritual joy. People gathered together, prayed together, as if they found an outlet from the bacchanalia that was going outwards. Republics were changing one another, money, governments, and there was peace and there was the truth of God. But this underground mountain church could not survive for a long time. Its priests suffered a terrible fate.
В августе 21 года эти монахи были...
In August 1921, these monks were shot by the Red Army men who were staying in their church. They came as Red Army men. The story is left, it is recorded. The monks even fed them there, treated with honey. There was an apiary, and then the soldiers shot them. Now there is a worship cross on this place, and there is an inscription that, yes, here on this place, there was an underground church and underground cells. Now there is nothing left except for this memorable sign. There is nothing else. One of the Ira monk Seraphim's companion was Viktor Matveyevich Matveyev. The traveler came to the city of Verny right before the revolution in Russia. From the information that has remained, it can be understood that this man was young, of short stature and had a long hair. He never washed, but nevertheless, he always smelled of spruce. He had a staff in his hands. He lived for a while on the same Maknatka, but after the church was emptied, no one had heard of him. There is no evidence that he was shot with the priests. Perhaps there was someone, and maybe someone used to come there after 1921, but it was temporary. Moreover, we must remember that in 1921 there was a mud flow. The tract itself changed and the place was actually abandoned. After this period of the 20s, the history of this church does not come up anywhere. If you take into account the fact that this church was destroyed in the 20s of the last century and Viktor Matveyev at that time was about 20 years old, he could be that old man who frightened the builders of Medeo in the 70s. But these are just assumptions. The very name Medeo also raises many questions. In the Soviet times, it was believed that it came from the abbreviation MDO, a local holiday home. Indeed, such organization existed there, but it had a different name, the 10th anniversary of Kazakhstan. In 1938, the tract was renamed into the tract of the Komsomol. Prior to that, it was called Medeo in honor of the head of the Volst of 3rd village of Verninsky district of Malo-Almatinsky Volst, Medeo Pusumanov. At the beginning of the last century, the town of Verny was a relatively small fortification with a population of no more than 30,000 people. There was also the main street, named after the Governor-General Kolpakovsky. Later it was renamed into Lenin Street. Now it is Dostik Avenue. Going by this road, you could ride a horse to the possessions of Medeo Pusumanov.
Он был волостным правителем Веренского уезда Семиреченской области, очень образованный.
He was a Volst governor of the Verninsky district of the Semirechye region, a very educated man who opened a school for Kazakh children who performed the Hajj to Mecca. He had houses built here in Verny, and already in the beginning of the 20th century, on the permission of the Governor-General of the Semirechye, he built several houses or other buildings on just there where the stadium is located. And there were places for wintering and summering. It was usually called the tract Kimasa. In general, the personality of Medeo Pusumanov is very important for historians and researchers. According to the data, he took an active part in the construction of the city of Verny. According to his order, a birch grove was planted along the road to the tract, gardens in the Kaminsky Plateau area and an oak grove where the Tuksib Sanatorium is now located. Medeo Pusumanov was one of the most active sponsors, as they say now, by donating funds to people who suffered from a devastating earthquake in 1887 in the city of Verny.
Он на свои деньги покупал средства для
He provided supply for the victims of the earthquake with his own money, passed yurts, supplied food, meat and other dairy products. All this was done absolutely as charity. He was well known also by the Governor-General Kolpakovsky, who was his friend, and by the well-known forester inspector, research forester Baum. They knew him and maintained friendly relations. And so did the architect engineer Zenkov. And Medvedsky, a well-known local historian, and many other educated people of their time. Medeo Pusumanov died in 1908, being only 58. He left behind a huge legacy and an equally impressive number of descendants. According to historical data, he had 20 children, 12 sons and 8 daughters. They owned these places until the 20s of the last century, until all these lands were transferred by Medeo Sandra Kim to the Soviet government. In 1920, when he arrived here, he arrived in Verny according to the order of a well-known commander of the armed forces of the Red Army at that time, the legendary Frunze, by the way, also our fellow countryman. Dmitry Andreevich Fumanov arrived here. Here he developed an ebullient activity to suppress the famous insurrection. He wrote my famous novel, not only the Chapayev, but also the Insurrection, devoted entirely to the events of the Verny Rebellion. It was Fumanov who gave the order to open the first recreation zone in the Medeo tract with a kumis camp in the building of the former forest school. Here he hunted, spent time, not only as a military man, as a special plenipotentiary of the Turk front, in the tract of Medeo. And in one of the orders signed by Dmitry Andreevich Fumanov, there is an instruction to arrange a kumis hospital for the wounded and sick, seriously ill Red Army men. Arrange it in the building of the forest school. This is the former wintering of the Medeo. Arrange it on Medeo. Since that time, from 1920, in an easy state of mind of the Commissioner Fumanov, this name has entered the history and strengthened there. The Medeo tract remembers tragic events. Mud flows. The speed of mud flows is 6 meters per second. Liquid mud mixes with boulders, blowing everything in its path. Reaching a height of 15 meters in the so-called head, this is the front wave. Cases were recorded when the height of the head was 25 meters. This place has experienced several such disasters. The first mudflow recorded in historical documents came down in 1887. Then it was provoked by an earthquake. But it did not reach the city. A year later, another mudflow came down. Then several blocks of Verny were demolished. Another test was waiting for the townspeople in 1889. Then, as a result of the descent of the mud avalanche, several streets were also demolished. It destroyed 3 streets. They were the Kopal Street, Gerda Street and Pushkin Street. The devastating mudflow passed on these 3 streets, breaking away from the small Almatinka. It demolished almost all the houses along these streets and stopped on a more level terrain near the Green Bazaar. It was called the Guest House those days. Even people in Moscow knew about this incident, this catastrophe. The leader of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, sent a telegram. What is this? An earthquake? They did not yet know the concept of mudflow. After this cataclysm, there were a few more mudflows, but they did not inflict significant damage to the city, which cannot be said about the July 7, 1963 disaster that occurred in the opposite part of the Almaty region. Then a powerful stream of mud with stones descended into Lake Issyk, as a result of which it broke through and the destructive flow collapsed with all its might on the village of the same name. After this tragedy, it was urgently decided to erect a protective dam on Medeu. The construction of this anti-mudflow dam began in 1966. They built it with 2 directed explosions. The first sounded in October 1966, the second in April 1967. After this, that area was improved and a ladder was built there. By the way, there are 842 steps in it. Few people know, but first, the dam was planned to be built in the usual way. According to the calculations of engineers and architects, this process would have taken 4 years. They did not have so much time because, according to forecasts, during this period, another large mudflow could occur, which would have captured an unfinished dam on its way. The second destructive mudflow, in fact, it also threatened our city. It was in 1972, in July of 1973. And at the same time, there was a dam, which was built already in the late 60s. It was built and reached a height of 144 meters. Now this dam is 800 meters wide at the base, more than 500 meters long. It reliably protects our city from the mudflows and can withstand the powerful onslaught of this natural disaster. The beginning of construction is also a unique story for this place. It was the second explosion in the world in terms of the amount of stored explosives. 5,291 tons. The world record for the amount of the exploded simultaneous explosive belongs to the Amur-Bukhara channel. 9,352 tons of dynamite were used there. Nevertheless, Medeu Gorge has gained worldwide fame much faster due to the very different records. Medeu was visited by many famous personalities. At that time, this sports facility was of great interest to all. The ice rink is high in the mountains, the triumph of human thought, the forge of records. It is how it was called in the Soviet newspapers. And there were reasons for that. Besides that, Medeu is the most high mountain skating rink in the world. So there was also the largest natural ice cover on which 47 world records were established. Many mistakenly think that the construction of this ice rink did not begin until 1972. In fact, during this period, the construction of a new sports complex with artificial ice started. Before this, there was a skating rink with a natural ice cover. It was the first high-mountain skating rink in history. The history of the Factory of Records began already in 1949. 2 years later, on February the 5th, 1951, the first all-union competitions were held here. The water temperature of the small Almatinka, the average annual temperature is about 5 degrees Celsius. Pretty cool mountain water. But it is very clean, and the filtered water of the mountain river Small Almatinka contributed to the fact that the ice on the ice rink was clean and very comfortable and the most optimal for skating. That's why many records weren't made somewhere in Siberia, not in other places, even more than in the famous Davos or other European ski resorts. It is on Medeu that many world records were set. In addition to the famous athletes, such as the legendary Norwegian Stan Stensen, there were some Soviet skaters, Yevgeny Kulikov, Valery Muratov, Sofia Kondakova and many others who set their records here. The celebrities of the Soviet stage, Arkady Raikin, Vladimir Vysotsky, Sofia Rotaru also loved to come here. The General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Leonid Brezhnev, also visited the rink. In 1990, the International Music Festival Asia Dalsi was held for the first time on the ice of the high mountain skating rink. For 13 times, this platform was a platform for the performance of talented performers from all over the world. Here sang Patricia Kaas, Toto Cutugno, Bonnie M, as well as a huge number of Kazakh artists. The Medeu rink is an architectural monument and is protected by the state. From here you can get to the ski resort Chimbulak. Now the car road to it is closed, that not to destroy ecology of this most beautiful place. but you can always use a cable car, an ecological taxi, or just walk. As for legends and mystics, everyone regards it in their own way. Someone believes in the other world, and someone says that imagination wakes up because of this magnificence of the nature. Fresh mountain air, magnificent landscapes, bright history. These are excellent reasons for coming to Medeo and experiencing all this personally. My name is Andrei Slozhin, and it was the Time Puzzle. See you.